quarter of a mile, slide right onto causeway A312. Take the next right onto causeway A312. Continue on A312 for 1 mile.
If your feelings are strong enough, you can take it down. And we've had listeners saying, well, you know, what next? Nelson statues, Queen Victoria. The worry that some listeners have expressed that this is a dangerous precedent. What do you say?
You have to think about why you have a statue that glorifies a mass murderer in any city centre. Isn't that questionable? You know, we kind of have to look at our own values and ethics and what civic, you know, responsibility is. You know, where is their duty of care under equal opportunities? I can't think of any other group that would happen to and be okay. You know, I mean, a lady earlier was saying that you would have a statue of Hitler in the centre. You know, it would be completely, or a statue of Jimmy Savile for that matter. You know, they're both considered to be philanthropists. It's completely, you know, wrong. You know, it's obscene.
In a quarter of a mile, at Wagoners Roundabout, take the second exit onto the Parkway A312.
Jim, you're very welcome. What do you think?
Well, the lady who has just been talking, you're not talking for the people that I lived with in the 70s and 80s and 90s. I had a family of 6 West Indian people living next door to me who, like myself, had no idea about the Colston statue. We didn't worry about it, we had no problems with it, and they were such a loving, lovely family. And everybody I've now spoken to recently, because I'm now 68.
Exit the roundabout onto the Parkway. Continue on the Parkway for 1 mile.
Every West Indian person I speak to is trying to stop their children from progressing with this nonsense, which is making life very difficult for them.
What's the nonsense you're talking about?
Well, the nonsense is that it happened many hundreds of years ago. We don't actually know what happened. Well, certainly myself and the next door neighbours of mine don't.
But do you think it's possible, Jim, the fact, as you've conceded, this is something you didn't know about and don't know much about, and you're entitled to that. But for people who do know more about it and who are deeply offended by it,
yes,
do you not accept their feelings?
History, we have to move on. We've got other issues, other problems, and if the majority of the older black people are happy that
You say the majority, but that's based on your experience of one set of neighbours.
Well, to be honest,
In a quarter of a mile, at Cranford Parkway interchange, take the second exit onto the M4 slip road to Heathrow Airport, M25.
and the parents are arguing against the children who are saying, well, this is a big issue, blah, blah, blah. And it's actually causing a split. They're not talking to each other.
Well, let me have Rose come back in and talk to you, Jim. Rose.
Sorry, what particular point did you want me to...
Well, what do you think of what Jim had to say? That in fact this is a dividing generations.
What, between older and younger?
Exit the roundabout onto the slip road.
Well, I think there are lots of things that divide people.
In a quarter of a mile, merge onto M4.
You know, if you have to look at the toppling of the statue in the context of 2020 and the brutal killing of George Floyd, you know, because that's, you know, and the Black Lives Matter movement. I mean, in Bristol, it was a march of 10,000 people, young people mainly, I do have to say. And I think, you know, what it has provided is not divisions, because, you know, the statue's now in the museum, you know, and providing education. I think people, the worry that because of how it came down, I don't think that statue would have moved if it hadn't.
Continue on M4 for 3 miles.
This was all a very long time ago.
What is hurt, ill feeling? What I observed actually after the killing, the brutal annihilation of George Floyd, and certainly in Bristol, was that a lot of people then began to open up about things they hadn't opened up before, and actually talk about what it was like growing up in Bristol. And I must have heard one of the most painful but story of abuse in school, and I have to say it's not the first. You know, I didn't grow up, you know, probably someone my age, but I do know a person, she is my age, and I just thought it just opens up a lot of wounds, and they're still there. You know, Bristol's a city where it's the worst city to be educated if you're of African heritage, and in terms of education opportunities, a 2017 Runnymede report cited. So there's lots of endemic issues of racial inequalities and injustice.
Thank you.
You know, particularly in education. And I think, you know, it obviously is an opportunity to look and deal with things. Since the toppling, it has got people thinking and wanting to improve things. So hopefully that journey will continue.
Rose, thank you very much. Very good to see you. That's Rose Martin, writer and artist from the Grassroots Counter and Colston Group in Bristol. Thanks to Jim in Weston-super-Mare. What about you? You can text 84850, tweet at LBC and call 0345 6060 973. Much more on this between now and 7. Also, you'll be aware lots of announcements tonight about COVID around Great Britain. We'll update you on the COVID report in just a moment. First, at 6:32, the headlines. Amelia Cox.
Wales says it will reluctantly follow the Prime Minister's decision to scrap pre-departure COVID tests for people arriving into England. Boris Johnson says the Omicron variant is so prevalent, the measures now have a limited impact on the spread of the disease. 4 people have been cleared of criminal damage for pulling down the statue of a slave trader in Bristol. The bronze figure of Edward Colston was toppled and thrown into the city's harbour during a Black Lives Matter protest in 2020. And police searching for a missing student have found the body of a man in the River Thames. 20-year-old Harvey Parker was last seen leaving a nightclub in central London on the 17th of December.
LBC Business Update.
With Direct Line Business Insurance, go direct and see if you could get a better deal.
Ryanair's passenger numbers dropped 7% in December as extra travel restrictions were imposed to tackle the Omicron variant. The airline saw the number of people on services drop to 9.5 million. LBC weather cold for much of the UK tonight, with rain arriving in Northern Ireland later, lows of -1 degree.
In a quarter of a mile, keep right to stay on M4.
Your Tiny QuickBooks team here. Self-assessment season is upon us. We make it so quick and easy. You might even enjoy it.
But seriously, let's get it all sorted before the 31st of January.
For available tax products, visit quickbooks.co.uk.
Keep right to stay on M4.
Your
visionary, an entrepreneur, a passionate business owner, driven by results and poised for growth.
Continue on M4 for 2 miles.
Businesses of all sizes to winnable council, NHS and national government contracts. Just sign up, match with tenders, and they'll help with the rest. Now is the time. Seize your opportunity.
In a quarter of a mile, keep right to stay on M4. Keep right to stay on M4. Continue on M4 for 4 miles.
Only 15 years after it was was arrested in 1894 after being commissioned by James Arrowsmith at a cost of £650. So it was a late Victorian cheap statue. Nobody knows what Colston looked like. So, you know, they couldn't raise money for a public subscription, so he had to fund it along with the merchant venturers of Bristol and several clergymen in the early 19th.
In 2 miles, at junction 6, take the A355 exit to Slough Central.
That's what Jim from Western-super-Mare was saying. He was saying that he doesn't know what happened, that nobody knows the truth about what happened. Well, of course, that's a nonsense. If he wants to know what happened, he can read my forthcoming book all about the captain of a slave trading ship called the Hannibal. Now, in 2010, Brecon City Council erected a plaque to a slave trader called Captain Thomas Phillips. The same weekend that Colston's statue was torn down through utter frustration, years of trying to have it removed, the plaque that Brecon Town Council erected in Brecon in Wales was also torn down, and it was thrown into the nearby river. But wisely, Brecon decided not to prosecute the people involved, persons involved, and they have actually retrieved it, and it's going to be put into a museum in the correct context. So statues were actually being torn down in their hundreds worldwide because there had been a moment of enlightenment when, you know, people had suddenly realized the true cost to humanity of the appalling death toll of enslaved African people. Under Edward Colston, Jim and David, this is for you, when he was the sub-governor of the Royal Acting Company between 1680 and 1692, it is estimated from the archives at Kew, trawling through all the RAC accounts, that 65,000 enslaved Africans were forcibly transported to the West Indies, with a mortality rate of 23%.
In a quarter of a mile, at junction 6, take the A355 exit to Slough Central.
Money, £35 billion profits were made by men like Edward Colston on the backs of absolutely indescribable human suffering.
Sue, stay right there. David.
Exit at junction 6.
I'm saying it's all fine and nice. Why didn't those who decided to take all into their own hands equip them?
In a quarter of a mile, at the roundabout, take the 3rd exit onto Tuns Lane, A355.
Don't want anyone to take the law into their own hands. That's the matter of the past. We don't want to go into those days when anybody could do anything. That's completely wrong.
David, thank you. And Sue, that's a central point that many listeners have made, that they might have a lot of sympathy for people like you and the Colston for themselves, but they worry that the act of tearing something down that people don't like is a dangerous precedent.
Yes, and I do have some sympathy for that argument. But in the case of this particular statue, serious campaigns were started in the 1990s by local civic groups and individuals to have Colston's statue removed. I mean, let's face it, to put a statue up to somebody who actually did some good for human beings who came from Bristol, you know, instead of a mass murderer. And they weren't listened to.
But just to take that point as logical conclusion, Sue, and I hear
Exit the roundabout onto Tuns Lane.
Then that if people hold campaigns to get things changed, and if they don't get their way, they take the law into their own hands. Don't you worry about that?
In a quarter of a mile, slight left towards Sippenham Lane.
One man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist, as they say. I mean, it's for the greater good, you could argue. Politicians stood on the fence in Bristol for years over the statue, and even the merchant venturers themselves who supported Colston, you know, they were built on the legacy of Colston, they put out a statement on the 12th of June in 2020, and I quote, "The fact that the statue is gone is right."
Slight left towards Sippenham Lane.
To build a city where racism and inequality no longer exist, we must start by acknowledging Bristol's dark past and removing statues.
Continue for 1.5 miles.
A man who benefited from trading in human lives. Now that comes from the mouth of the merchant venturer.
Sue, thank you. David, thank you. Let me know what you think. 0345 6060 973. As I say, lots of developments on COVID tonight, in terms of PCR, in terms of who you want to travel, with all the details in the COVID report. Charlotte Lynch.
That's right, Eddie. Lots of changes to COVID testing rules. The big one being that people who test positive on a lateral flow test will not need confirmation from a PCR. It's aimed at easing pressure on PCR testing capacity because, of course, far less of them will be used. NHS staff who are usually asked to take one if somebody they live with tests positive before they can go into work will get better access to them. It also means that people who don't have symptoms can start their isolation straight away and therefore end it sooner. The Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced the changes also for testing rules to international travel in the Commons earlier.
Now Omicron is so prevalent, these measures are having limited impact on the growth in cases while continuing to pose significant costs to our travel industry. So I can announce that in England from 4 a.m. on Friday, we will be scrapping the pre-departure test, which discourages many from travelling for fear of being trapped overseas and incurring significant extra expense. We will also be lifting the requirement to self-isolate on arrival until receipt of a negative PCR, returning instead to the system we had in October last year, where those arriving in England will need to take a lateral flow test no later than the end of day 2, and if positive, a further PCR test to help us identify any new variants at the border.
Scotland's self-isolation rules are also being brought into line with the rest of the UK, cutting the period from 10 days to 7, and from midnight entire households won't have to quarantine, replaced with daily lateral flow testing for a week. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon's also confirmed that people in Scotland who test positive on a lateral flow, as long as they don't have symptoms, don't need a PCR.
The safest thing to do at this stage is to treat a positive lateral flow test as confirmation of COVID, even if you have no symptoms. This allows us to maximise testing capacity and ensure a speedier start to the process of contact tracing and advice.
A further 194,747 people have tested positive for COVID in the UK in the latest 24 hours. There have also been a further 334 deaths within 28 days of a positive result. That figure does take into account 4 days of data following delays over the Christmas period. The Office for National Statistics, though, has said that more than 3.5 million people in the UK likely had COVID last week. In London, that figure is as many as 1 in 10. Although the ONS said there were early signs in the last few days of 2021 that infections were no longer increasing in the capital, they say it's too early to suggest if this is a continuing change in trend. Well, Downing Street has confirmed that more than 20 hospital trusts across the country have declared critical incidents because of the number of staff off isolating. The Education Secretary Nadeem Zahawi's also been speaking in the House of Commons as teacher shortages are expected. He announced from Monday there will be on-site vaccination centres for all students who are eligible for jabs, and he said teaching must remain face-to-face.
I have absolute faith in our teaching communities. Teachers, classroom assistants, nursery providers, heads and lecturers in all our education settings have worked miracles throughout this pandemic and continue to do so.
And Mr. Zahawi also announced Ofsted inspections will be temporarily suspended to ease pressure. And France, Eddie, has just reported more than 335,000 new cases of COVID in the latest 24 hours. It marks a new daily record in France by some stretch.
Charlotte Lynch with your COVID report. Much more on the Colston 4 to come. Now, 6:48. More headlines. Amelia Cox.
People arriving into England and Wales from abroad won't have to take a pre-departure COVID test from Friday. 4 people have been cleared of criminal damage after pulling down a statue of a